This is the first Xbox handheld. Or at least it kind of is. I think most of us can agree, when you hear the words Xbox handheld, you imagine an Xbox console that's shrunk down to this form factor. And honestly, on the surface, this feels a lot like that. It's got the Xbox branding, it looks like an Xbox controller, it even boots straight into the Xbox app. But underneath all of that, this is still very much a PC. The new ROG Xbox Ally X, which is an insanely long name by the way, is a collaboration effort with Asus that takes the original Ally, gives it a refreshed design, bumps up the specs, and also introduces an entirely new software experience. And in a lot of ways, this might be the closest thing that we've had to a true console handheld experience since the Steam Deck. I've been using this for the past week now, and I definitely have some thoughts, so let's talk about what makes it so interesting. Okay, so unboxing this thing and getting it all set up, first impressions, it feels great in the hands. It comes in at 715 grams, which is a bit heavier than the Steam Deck at 640 grams, but it does feel really well balanced. I know when this first got initially leaked, people weren't a huge fan of this grip design, but I gotta say, I'm actually a huge fan of it. This is something that you ultimately want to be able to hold comfortably for hours at a time, and I think taking the Xbox style grips here and putting them into the handheld just makes a lot of sense. Similar to a normal controller, you of course have the analog joysticks, your A, B, X, Y buttons, a D-pad, left and right bumpers, and of course now impulse triggers, which give you that haptic feedback to immerse you in your gameplay even more. You do have two buttons on the back that I'm gonna be honest are a little bit awkward to use. I do kind of wish they had adopted something like the Xbox Elite controller paddles here. Otherwise though, this feels like they took an Xbox controller, stretched it out, and put a display in the middle. And that display is fine. You're getting a 7-inch 1080p IPS panel with variable refresh rate up to 120 Hz, and that genuinely does make a difference, especially in something like Forza Horizon or FPS games, for example. If I'm being honest, I do wish it was OLED, especially after using the Steam Deck for a while now, but it does make up for it in other ways. Even when the frame rate inevitably does dip, I've noticed that the experience stays pretty smooth and consistent. There's no real screen tearing or anything like that. And ultimately, you do get a nice gaming experience, which is what matters at the end of the day. It's obviously not as punchy as an OLED panel, but it is sharp, it's fast, it feels really responsive in motion, and obviously going with this panel over an OLED does keep the cost down for consumers, so I understand why they went in that direction. The biggest change, and honestly one of the most exciting in my opinion, comes with the new Xbox full screen experience. And that's also where this new Xbox button comes into play. I think I can speak for most of us in saying that normal Windows on a handheld is just not that enjoyable of an experience. It's clunky, it feels bloated, and ultimately, it's just not built to navigate with a handheld. Thankfully, we now have what feels like a true contender to Steam OS. Now, when you power on your device, it boots straight into the Xbox full screen experience with a clean console style dashboard. I do want to make something very clear. This is not a portable Xbox console. You can't just download the games that you have installed on your Xbox, or at least most of them, and play them here natively. What you can do though is stream those games to your handheld, either using Xbox Cloud Gaming or Remote Play using your Series X or S at home. So this is not replacing your Xbox. This is almost extending it. And since it's still a Windows handheld PC at the end of the day, you're getting access to so many other platforms beyond just Xbox. You can do this by simply tapping the Xbox button and accessing any of the launchers you have installed there, or by holding down the Xbox button and jumping to tabs that you already have open. I even went ahead and enabled Steam Big Picture mode, and it feels really nice to navigate. Also, if you primarily game on Steam, you could just close the Xbox app once you have Steam open and use this thing almost like a Steam Deck. The new software also does make this incredibly nice to use docked with a controller. This is a $30 one I picked up off Amazon. It can use the Ally's charger. It runs 4K at 144 Hz, and everything just works. You can still access everything by just tapping or holding down on the Xbox button, just like you would on the handheld. And I can't stress enough just how frictionless this setup is. I honestly think I'm going to be using this docked way more than I thought I was going to. The software is super intuitive to use. It feels incredibly fast and responsive. And I think the best part about this is eventually coming to all Windows handhelds, not just the new Xbox ones. So Microsoft actually kind of cooked here. On that note, it's important to mention that the Xbox Ally X is actually shipping with AMD's new Ryzen AI Z2 Extreme processor, which to my knowledge is the first handheld using this specific chip. And that AI edition of the chip actually does make a difference. You're now getting a dedicated NPU with up to 50 TOPS of AI performance. Now, we're not really seeing that AI hardware utilized in games yet, but it does make this device a bit more future-proof. For example, ASR, or Automated Super Resolution, is slated to come to the handheld in 2026. And And this is a system level feature that will use the NPU to upscale games running at lower resolutions with no additional changes required from game developers. That would be a pretty huge deal. Of course, you should never buy something off the promise of what might come later, but what does matter is how this thing performs out of the box. So let's find out. Starting out with Forza Horizon on high settings at 1080p pulling around 25 watts, I was seeing around the 80 to 90 FPS range on average, and the game runs incredibly smooth. No major dips or stutters that I noticed when driving around, everything worked great. Of course, we had to test the new Battlefield 6. I went with the recommended performance settings at 1080p, and we were getting right around 30 to 40 FPS. Again, this is with that 25 watt turbo mode engaged, which is absolutely going to rip through your battery, but it was surprisingly smooth. I wasn't fully satisfied with this though, so I did go back later and tweak this a bit more just to see how much performance you could really squeeze out of Battlefield, and simply by turning FSR to balanced and bumping the resolution down to 900p, your frame rate actually doubles. This can obviously apply to so many other games as well. Take No Man's Sky for example. Here we're running on standard graphics at 1080p and getting around 60 FPS. Simply bumping the resolution down to 900p, the game is now running at 80 plus frames and honestly doesn't look that different. So just something to keep in mind as you're messing with your settings. Switching gears, I've been playing a lot of Skate lately, and while this game seems hardly optimized at the moment, I was still comfortably holding around 80 to 90 frames, sometimes higher depending on the area that I was in. Again, we're on medium settings here, and honestly, even sitting here recording these tests, I found myself just getting lost in the gameplay. Something like Skate, for example, just feels like it was built to be played in this form factor. Of course, this is going to be perfect for indie games as well. You'll obviously see both great performance here as well as the best battery life. And a pro tip, if you want to save even more battery life for these lower demanding games, you can actually turn off the CPU boost setting, which is enabled by default in Armory Crate. Where things get even more interesting though is when you're not running things locally. For example, this is Cyberpunk 2077, completely maxed out streaming from my RTX 4090 PC back at home using Remote Play. Now, my Wi-Fi at home is arguably worse than it is here at the studio, so take this test with a grain of salt. But the fact that I'm able to stream from my PC at home to the Ally X here in the studio with minimal input latency is pretty nuts. Of course, this isn't a new feature. The Steam Deck has been able to do this really well for years, but it's all about options, right? This is able to play AAA titles on its own, on top of streaming from your console, like your Xbox, for example, on top of using Steam's Remote Play. So this kind of gives you everything in one package. As you can imagine, streaming games also improves battery life a lot. That 80 watt hour battery paired with your handheld hardly doing any work really goes a long way. Fan noise as well, right? I honestly thought this was already pretty quiet even when playing pretty demanding games, but when you're streaming games, there is zero fan noise. And I know it might be a bit of a weird concept talking about streaming games to your handheld, but we live in a small apartment, for example. There's only one TV, so sometimes I want to play Xbox, but I can't. I can just stream it to this now instead. It's one of those features you honestly don't think you'll use until you try it, and then you realize just how much more opens up in this little handheld. So yeah, this thing has just been a ton of fun to use. In a lot of ways, it feels like the ultimate backlog killer. For years, Windows handhelds have been powerful but frustrating. This one finally just works.